welcome to your Access Point to Washington. I'm Ayesha Tanzeem. A day after the UN raised the status of the Palestinian Authority from an entity to a non-member state, Israel retaliated by withholding $100 million in tax revenue from the PA and reviving plans to build 3,000 settler homes in a highly sensitive area of the West Bank called E1. International reaction was severe. VOA's Joy Wagner explains why.
Israel has been building settlements in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem since 1967, and while the international community has declared the settlements illegal, never has Israel seen such a severe reaction over a building plan. Its traditional allies, like Britain, Germany, and Australia, are mad. Some other European countries, like France, have warned of possible punitive steps. Even Israel's staunchest ally, the United States, has spoken up against it. White House spokesman Jay Carney said that the U.S. has communicated its position to Israel.
We reiterate our long-standing opposition to Israeli settlement activity and East Jerusalem construction.
The reason for such a stern reaction is the geography. The E1 is a mostly empty area between the Jewish settlement of Ma'ale Adumim and East Jerusalem. If Israel builds on this area, it would physically cut off Palestinians in the West Bank from their desired future capital, East Jerusalem. And despite the international pressure, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Wednesday that Israel will go ahead with its plans. Joy Wagner, VOA News, Washington.
Joining me to talk about the impact of the Israeli decision is a very distinguished panel of experts. In studio, we have Omar Baddar, a political scientist, a human rights activist, and a new media professional. On Skype with us is Dr. Joel Peters from Virginia Tech. He specializes in the field of global security and conflict resolution. And on the telephone, we have Dr. Josef Olmert, a top Middle East scholar, former peace negotiator, former advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, and as his name suggests, brother of another Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. And Dr. Olmert, I want to start with you. I was reading Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's interview to a German newspaper, Die Welt, and he doesn't seem too perturbed by the international hue and cry over the E1 construction. Does the international condemnation make a difference to Israel at this point?
Well, it's a good question. There are a few points to be made here. One of them is that he was visiting Germany, and despite the report of your correspondent, meeting with Chancellor Merkel was very good for him. And basically the Chancellor was very mellow in her criticism of Israel and much stronger in its support for Israel on any other issue. So Netanyahu, of course, reflected the atmosphere of this particular visit. But then there are two other points at play here. One of them is that there is an election campaign in Israel now. It's election season there, and Netanyahu wanted all along to focus the campaign on foreign policy and security issues rather than the social and economic issues, because the Israeli economy, while doing very well, may be suffering from the effects of world recession as any other big economy in the West. So in that sense, what happened in the UN does not necessarily play badly with the overall strategy of Mr. Netanyahu. Whether we agree with the strategy or not is something else, but from his perspective, that may play into his game plan. And then there is another point, and this is that, look, I mean, all these criticisms were being expressed, some of them more sharp, some of them less sharp. But in the end of the day, when we look at the Middle East today, we know that the real concern of the U.S., of Germany, of France, of Britain, and of Israel is, of course, what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Egypt. These are much bigger issues. And
okay, Dr. Olmert,
on this being
Dr.
the case.
Olmert, you seem...
Again, let me just finish, please. Whether we agree with what he did or not, and by the way, I disagree with his decision, but from his perspective, he can sum up the week as being a successful one.
Okay, so you raised a very good point about the election season being in Israel, and also during his interview to Die Welt, I have something that he said. Bibi Netanyahu said that this is only planning, and if the Palestinians don't act unilaterally, then in his words, we won't have any purpose to do so either. So, Dr. Peters, I want to come to you. Is it then just political posturing at this point? Because after all, this is just in planning phases. The construction may be several years away and may or may not happen.
I think you could maybe read into the Die Welt interview maybe a soft peddling, a soft backpedaling by the Prime Minister but I tend to agree with Dr. Olmert that this is election season, and Netanyahu is speaking to his domestic audience, but he does have to take into account the very strong international criticism, which I think has taken Israel back a little bit. The vehemence in Europe is unprecedented. Even today, Canada, a staunch ally of Israel in the past couple of years, has voiced its concern. So I think there is a soft peddling, but not sort of a retreat. No Israeli prime minister, no Israeli politician in an election campaign can sort of be seen to be backing down. But I think you can see that there may be a soft peddling, and when this all quietens down, eventually diplomacy will take its play rather than megaphone diplomacy, which we're seeing at the moment.
So there's another point that I want to come to you, Omar, which is the American administration has also spoken up against it. I'll have here words of the White House spokesman calling it counterproductive, State Department calling it especially damaging. America's the staunchest ally of Israel. Do these words or this criticism mean anything in real terms?
That's going to be the question moving forward. Criticism of Israeli settlement expansion from the Obama administration and previous administrations is nothing new. Ehud Olmert, as I'm sure Josef Olmert knows well, described this move as a slap in the face of President Obama. What we're seeing right now is Netanyahu trying to take advantage of the fact that President Obama is embroiled in fiscal cliff negotiations with the Republicans and too distracted to focus on this to make this provocative announcement. But I think that Obama, despite being in a difficult position, now has to make a choice. Either the U.S. plays a more significant leadership role in putting pressure on the Israelis to back down from this step, or alternatively, they will be consigning themselves to political irrelevance in this entire situation. The U.S. has been embarrassed enough times by Israel disregarding international law, disregarding the U.S. administration's position on this. And I think taking this step, this very sensitive step that could potentially kill an already damaged and tinkering two-state solution, I think puts the Obama administration in a very difficult position.
So we'll come to the two-state solution question in a minute, but Dr. Olmert, what I want to ask you is the unconditional support that U.S. has given Israel in the past. The U.S. Congress hinted that if the Palestinians go to the UN unilaterally, they might slap sanctions, they might hold back money. Do you think this move by Israel, after this, the U.S. Congress will still be able to slap sanctions on the Palestinian Authority?
Oh, no question about that. Look, with all due respect to what Omar said, and even to what former Prime Minister Olmert said, and I have known him for many years, that's true, 62 years to be precise, all this is a little bit irrelevant because, look, in the end of the day, there is not going to be any construction there. This is a typical Israeli announcement which is causing maximum damage to Israel without having anything in return. But then after a week or so, nothing really happens, and people move on to the real bigger agenda. And the real bigger agenda is the question of how to reactivate the peace process. And on this question, the American administration was much sharper against the PLO or Palestinian move going to the UN than what it was against the Israeli move to retaliate, so to speak, with this stupid announcement on the settlements. So the real question is staying with us, and this is what can be done in order to reactivate the peace process. I am one of those who keep saying all the time that Mr. Netanyahu, that is going apparently to be the next prime minister, again, whether everybody likes it or not, but he's going to win this election. He needs to move ahead with the peace process, but he can't do it by himself. So as much as he needs to change the rhetoric after the elections and needs to do also all kinds of gestures on the ground that will be even unilateral to mollify the Palestinian side, he also needs to have a Palestinian partner. And Mr. Abbas cannot claim to be the leader of the Palestinians, but not to be the leader of them when it comes, say, to Hamas or to Gaza or to other expressions of dissidence among the Palestinians. So the two leaders need to understand that the real move ahead should be negotiations. And whether it is the initiative of Obama or not, that should be their initiative. It's for our peoples, the Palestinians and the Israelis. And Netanyahu should do his bit about it, but also Mr. Abbas should do.
Okay, so Dr. Peters, what I want to ask you is what Bibi Netanyahu complained in his interview, and I have his words here, that the fact that the Palestinians tore to shreds their commitments under the Oslo Accords and went to the UN unilaterally is somehow dismissed. The world community is reacting really severely over Israel's announcement. to build, while an overwhelming majority, 138 countries of the member states of the UN voted in favor of giving Palestinians a non-member state status?
This is the real challenge is how to renew political negotiations, and this isn't an easy challenge. I think all the polls indicate that Israel not only will be led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he will have a right-wing coalition. And it is a coalition, and it could potentially be a government who isn't interested in really engaging in the idea of a two-state solution. Likewise, there is a question about the Palestinian question. We haven't mentioned the issue of Gaza and Hamas. So whom does Israel negotiate with? Clearly, the UN vote gives legitimacy, or a further legitimacy, to the idea of a two-state solution. But that has been the position of the international community for the better part of a decade, if not 2 decades, of a need for a two-state solution. So I see this vote as adding more legitimacy to a standing international position. But our forces in Israel who are opposed to that, this move, I agree, I don't think we'll see building in the E1 area. This has been, the question of E1 has been on the agenda on and off for over a decade. This is nothing new. Israel has announced in the past its intention or its desire to build there. The real challenge is going to be how does the incoming...
So here's another thing, and Omar, I want to come to you, which is a lot of people, including world leaders, have said if this plan goes through, and there's a big if there, as all of you seem to agree, if this plan goes through, that's the end of the two-state solution. However, Mr. Netanyahu disagrees with you guys. He's saying in his interview that they're talking about a contiguous state when Gaza and West Bank is not contiguous. He's also saying that, you know, the E1 area that they're building in is only a 1 mile or 2 mile wide area that connects Jerusalem to a suburb, that in all peace plans will remain part of the state of Israel, and that in the final settlement agreement, Mali Adumim is going to be part of Israel, and that they can always build tunnels around it. So there's no problem there.
Netanyahu does not think that cutting off Palestinians from Jerusalem is a detriment to the two-state solution, because his idea of a two-state solution is taking whatever land he wants and leaving the Palestinians with scraps that they can then call a state. The problem is that's not going to solve the conflict. What solving the conflict requires a real end to the occupation and allowing the Palestinians to have a viable state, which proceeding with this absolutely would completely block. Now, the goal is not really just return to negotiations, but a return to meaningful negotiations, because we've seen between 1993 and 2000, there have been negotiations, and all we saw throughout that entire time is a continuation of Israeli settlement expansion, making a Palestinian state less and less viable. So I think in this move, what we saw in the UN, when Israel voted against the idea of a Palestinian state in the 1967 borders, is an end to the facade that Israel is interested in the creation of a real viable Palestinian state, and an end to the fantasy that negotiations on their own can achieve anything. So right now the entire world at this point understands that achieving any kind of progress towards a two-state solution requires real pressure to be put on Israel. And I think that's the big achievement of this UN vote, is that even though it's symbolic and doesn't change anything on the ground.
What about, and I'll ask Dr. Olmert about pressure on Israel, what about pressure on the Palestinian Authority?
That's the thing, pressure to do what exactly at this point? I mean, they've bent over backwards, as the Palestinian papers, the Palestine papers showed a couple of years ago, to try to accommodate Israeli interest in territorial expansion in the West Bank. And at some point, you're just going to have to say that what we want is something that is viable. And I think that the pressure really ought to be focused on the Israeli government.
On Israel. Dr. Olmert, do you agree that right now the key is to pressurize Israel?
Well, no, I disagree with Omar, at least in one point, and Omar should know it, because he mentioned before former Prime Minister Olmert, and former Prime Minister Olmert met with Abbas 11 times, and they almost came to an agreement which Abbas in the end did not like to sign, and there was not even at one point in time any condition on the part of Abbas that anything like settlement freeze should be imposed. So let's put this question of settlements to rest, in the sense that this is, of course, a very crucial and significant question, but not the most significant question. There are other questions at play, and in order to have an objective picture of the situation, we need to talk about all this. But look, what does it mean, pressure on Israel? In the end of the day, within days, maybe within hours, as we talk, the real problems of the Middle East will completely shift from what is being discussed here, and not that I'm disrespecting our conversation, God forbid, into the situation in Syria and Egypt. And the point I'm trying to make here is a bigger one. Look, the events of recent weeks, including what happened in Gaza, prove, and Omar may not like to hear it, he may not agree with me on this, that the Palestinian issue ceased to be the key issue of the Middle East today. That is not to say that there shouldn't be a solution to it, not at all. But there are other bigger issues right now that are on top of the agenda of other countries, and on many of those issues, Israel is on one side with most of the world, including most of the Arab world, by the way. So, therefore, all this question of pressure on Israel, if you isolate it from any other issue that is taking place right now in the Middle East, of course, yeah, there will be pressure on Israel. There already is pressure on Israel. Every announcement against Israel, every recalling of Israeli ambassadors by foreign ministers in other countries to be reprimanded for what's happening, it's pressure on Israel. But this is not really going to be of any significance, because the bigger issues will be at play. Therefore,
the other
I
issues,
keep saying again and again, Abbas has to come to the negotiations table, and he could do something very simple, by the way. Not that I am his advisor, but he could say to Netanyahu,
just to come to the negotiation table.
I already had a peace plan from a democratically elected Prime Minister of Israel called Ehud Olmert. Let's negotiate on the basis of that.
Okay.
So that could put Netanyahu in some kind of a corner, but they don't say. They basically try to come to terms with Hamas. Fine, let's come to terms with Hamas on the basis of negotiations, but not on the basis of negating the right of Israel to exist. And that will be the key to all that.
Okay,
so
and I understand that.
But also,
I understand that Omar wants to add, but Omar,
to
let me also bring Dr. Peters into this discussion. Dr. Peters, do you agree that right now the Israeli-Palestinian issue is not the key issue in the Middle East? There are other bigger issues that the world is focused on?
I think you have to separate 2 points. Look, there's no question about a doubt the issue. The situation in Syria is critical. The developments in recent days in Egypt are worrying. The question of Iran cannot be ignored. I mean, these are big issues, but that doesn't mean to say that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is equally not a big issue, which demands attention and can be just put on the back burner because all of these other issues. So one has to sort of not ignore what's happening in the region, as Dr. Olmert rightly said, but that doesn't mean to say that one should deprioritize the need to find a solution and get Israel and the Palestinians back to the negotiating table. And I think there have been meaningful negotiations. I don't think you can dismiss the discussions between Prime Minister Olmert and President Abbas as not meaningful. But I think what one has to see in the coming months, or when the new Obama administration is sworn in, is the degree of a commitment rather than the lip service to the idea of a two-state solution. And that demands an engaged international commitment to see this through. And that also demands from the Israeli government a commitment in practice and actions and statements on the ground, as we've seen, which do not build confidence. And what is needed is to build an atmosphere of confidence and of trust. And whilst I also am skeptical that we will see building in E1, one has to see measures by Israel of commitment to peace, and one also has to see measures by the Palestinians of an engagement to see this to the end.
Okay, so Omar, you were shaking your head constantly while Dr. Olmert was speaking. What part of his statement do you disagree with?
Virtually the entire thing. I mean, right now Israel is facing unprecedented diplomatic isolation because of its actions, as we saw in the UN vote and the condemnation that we're
But
seeing.
he just said that Angela Merkel, although in her statement she said we agreed to disagree, but it wasn't too much pressure on Israel.
I mean,
it wasn't at all any pressure. She was very friendly towards Netanyahu.
Yeah, that's the thing. But this is a very predictable distraction measure that we're seeing right now. Because Israel is under pressure, we always want to pretend that what's happening in Palestine doesn't matter and we should focus on Syria and Iran and Egypt and what have you. These are all important issues. There's no question about it. But Palestine is the wound that is in the heart of the entire Arab world. It is really the prism through which the entire Arab world views international relations. It absolutely is. And if Mr. Olmert is interested in coming back to the negotiations, it is so easy to do it. All Israel has to do is stop building illegal settlements on Palestinian land and the negotiations would be restarted. I mean, the idea that Palestinian refusal to come back to the negotiations table while Israel keeps taking more land.
Palestinians have negotiated in the past while settlement activity was going on.
On the assumption that there's going to be some good faith effort on Israel to allow for a viable Palestinian state to come about. 20 years later, the facade is falling apart. We've already seen what they've done throughout the negotiations. As Palestinian negotiators put it, it's like two people coming to negotiate on how to divide a pizza while one side is actively eating everything and leaving the crust to the other side. That's not a negotiation.
Dr. Olmert, first of all, two things. First of all, what Omar just said, that Palestinians have in the past come to the negotiation table while the settlement activity was going on. It didn't work. Israel didn't stop settlement. And the second thing is this announcement, even if it's just an announcement of trying to build an E1, wouldn't it strengthen Hamas against the Palestinian Authority and weaken the Palestinian Authority?
I really don't look. I mean, everything that happens, you can argue that Hamas is getting stronger. I don't think that Hamas is getting stronger because of that, or I don't think that Hamas got stronger because of what happened in Gaza. They were heavily defeated militarily. But the fact that they could shoot more missiles doesn't mean that they had a victory like they celebrate. In the end of the day, they have to take care of the population in Gaza now. They need billions of dollars that they need to get from somebody, and they have to get it from the Western world in the end of the day, and they will have to accommodate themselves to that. So let's see how that develops. But look, the point about settlements is very, very simple. There are no new settlements being built. I mean, that's the truth of the matter. There are talks about that. Does it create more confidence? No. And Joel Peters is very right about that. And therefore, we should stop this nonsense about talking about something that we are not going to do. But in the end of the day, and Mr. Omar should know, and I think that Mr. Abbas knows, Ma'ale Adumim is going to stay as part of Israel. It is closer to Jerusalem than what Bethesda is closer to downtown Washington, where you are sitting right now. Nobody in the right mind even consider that being dismantled and not being part of the state of Israel. And Netanyahu was right about that. Where he is wrong is that he doesn't seem to understand, and this is probably a point of controversy that I have with him. I mean, personally, I can say it. He doesn't seem to understand that not everything is about PR and, as they say in Hebrew, asbara. You can say whatever you like about settlements, and from my perspective, it might be true. But look, the world doesn't like it. And because the U.S. is so friendly with Israel, and the U.S. supported Israel in the UN General Assembly, why would you irritate the U.S. by saying something they're not going to do, which is the weakest point of the relationship? So Netanyahu is very provocative for his own domestic agenda. And you know what? Leadership is not about domestic agenda only. It's about overall statesmanship. It's about time that he goes beyond that. He's going to win these elections with or without these statements. So why would he be engaged in this kind of statement? I disagree with it. I don't like it. But let's sum it up by saying, hey, look, Abbas cannot wash his hands off all that by saying, hey, look, the Israelis are now isolated. We are not isolated. And Omar, you're making a big mistake about that. We are not isolated as much as you think that we are. America doesn't isolate us. Canada doesn't isolate us. And I can give you many other countries. So let's get back into the negotiation table without thinking that we are scoring points only by debating with each other.
But Dr. Olmert, didn't 138 countries vote against Israel's wishes by granting the Palestinian Authority a non-member observer state
But you
status?
know what? If I was Netanyahu, I would not even have objected it. And on this one, I agree with my older brother in that sense, because who cares? After 65 years, the Palestinians decided to accept the UN resolution about two-state solution. Fine, good for them. And now let's debate how to implement the principle that after 65 years of tragedy and misery, the Palestinians finally accepted. You know, that should have been the Israeli reaction. That would have taken all the heat out of that. But because of domestic politics, Netanyahu chose to make a bigger issue out of that. He did it deliberately, by the way.
Oh, okay. So, Omar, you want to add something to it?
The Palestinians accepted the idea of a two-state solution back in the late 80s, at the latest, if not even before that. So the idea that this is a new realization that they've come to is completely absurd. I mean, they've been arguing for it for so long.
Hamas didn't accept it. The Palestinian Authority has been.
A big question, you know, just to address the issue of Hamas and the Gaza Strip. Of course, they did not win militarily. Nobody can defeat Israel in the region militarily. There are, you know, the regional superpower. But this was a political victory for Hamas because it proved that it is only, unfortunately, the side, the Palestinian Authority, which has been in favor of negotiations and bending over backwards to try to accommodate Israeli wishes, has been able to achieve nothing for Palestinians and their rights. On the other hand, the people who are actually using violence are the ones who are actually able to make some level of advancement. So in that sense, you're granting legitimacy to the extremists who are using violence and taking it away from the people who are in favor of negotiations.
Who want to negotiate. Dr. Peters, I want to bring you in. There are other actors in this formula. Israel and Palestinian Authority are not the only one. What kind of pressure would the statement put on Egypt, which played a key role during the recent fighting?
Well, first I just would like to comment, I'm not quite clear what advancement Hamas achieved. if one's talking about advancement to a peaceful resolution of a conflict or towards a two-state solution. And I don't think that the Palestinian Authority has just been wasting their time. I mean, the only way that this conflict can be resolved is through negotiation. I think that the statement is, as Dr. Olmert said, is simply PR, and it's counterproductive, and to the point of it being pointless. And it also, not so much that it isolates Israel, but it raises doubts or within the frustration of the international community about the intentions and the true intentions of any government led by Bibi Netanyahu to actually sit down and engage in the negotiations towards a two-state solution. Whether Ma'ale Adumim remains within Israel at the outcome of any negotiations. For
Dr.
Egypt,
Peters,
I mean, Egypt has strategic interests. The actors in the region and in the international community are not taken by surprise by the game that's going on at the moment.
Dr. Peters, if I may interrupt, because we're on our last few minutes of the show, you wrote an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post saying that the situation on the ground is irreversible. What did you mean by that?
Because I think that one sees that the degree of the geographical contours of the settlement building and the way Israeli society sees the possibility of peace is that the old construct of the two-state solution of a territorial compromise is coming harder and harder to achieve.
Has it reached that critical point after which there may not be a two-state solution, in your opinion?
I don't think it's reached sort of the critical point, but, you know, we've been talking, or people have been talking for 10, 15, if not 20 years, that we've gone to the point of no return. But I think what we were pointing out in this op-ed in the Jerusalem Point is that there is still the dynamic of Palestinian statehood, which has to be matched with the reality of the situation on the ground. And one has to think about ways of sort of marrying those two contradictions and not just reading off an old script of sort of just simply a two-state solution, a return to the 1967 borders. It's not that I'm not calling for a Palestinian state. I've been advocating this for over 30 years when it was never popular within Israeli political discourse. But one has to start looking at the realities and start thinking about how we move forward rather than just sort of reciting off old scripts. That was the...
Yes. Okay, Omar. Isn't it time, yes, given the Palestinian Authority has been talking in the past, but they haven't been talking now, is it in time they come back to the table and let's hash out all these things, as Dr. Olmert was saying?
You cannot have an authority that has promised its people progress towards statehood, having engaged in these negotiations for as long as they have without being able to produce anything, saying, okay, we're going to go back to the negotiations while Israel continues to undermine the two-state solution every single day. There has to be some shift in the dynamic in order for them to go back.
All the talk about settlement is just talk. Even there's no building activity going on.
The expansion of current settlements is definitely still happening. I mean, even if they're not building new settlements, the expansion of current settlements is still happening. And again, I mean, coming back to the negotiation table based on what exactly? They have come back time and again. And it was a condition that the Obama administration as well put, calling on Israel to halt settlement expansion in order for negotiations to happen again. And Israel refused. I mean, the idea that they're just saying they're refusing but are not actually building. Why are we constantly being concerned about Israel's domestic political concerns and constraints without ever being concerned about Palestinian concerns?
Because for these 9 months of the freeze of settlement that Israel agreed to, nothing also happened. So, I mean, you can't have it both ways. Netanyahu did agree to the condition put by Obama. And what happened? Nothing happened. So, let's leave this settlement business aside.
He continued to expand settlements in Jerusalem, and that is illegally occupied as well.
So you guys both disagree on what settlement activity is. I guess the very definition of it seems to be in dispute. We might have to do another program on how we define settlements. But for now, that's all the time we have. Before we leave, I want to thank all of my guests, Dr. Josef Olmert, Omar Baddar, Dr. Joel Peters. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for watching. Please remember that we read all of your comments, so make sure you leave your comments on our Facebook page and also ideas for our future shows. We look forward to reading them. Goodbye.
Israel will go ahead with its plans. Joy Wagner, VOA News, Washington.
Joining me to talk about the impact of the Israeli decision is a very distinguished panel of experts. In studio, we have Omar Baddar, a political scientist, a human rights activist, and a new media professional. On Skype with us is Dr. Joel Peters from Virginia Tech. He specializes in the field of global security and conflict resolution. And on the telephone, we have Dr. Josef Olmert, a top Middle East scholar, former peace negotiator, former advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, and as his name suggests, brother of another Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. And Dr. Olmert, I want to start with you. I was reading Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's interview to a German newspaper, Die Welt, and he doesn't seem too perturbed by the international hue and cry over the E1 construction. Does the international condemnation make a difference to Israel at this point?
Well, it's a good question. There are a few points to be made here. One of them is that he was visiting Germany, and despite the report of your correspondent, meeting with Chancellor Merkel was very good for him. And basically the Chancellor was very mellow in her criticism of Israel and much stronger in its support for Israel on any other issue. So Netanyahu, of course, reflected the atmosphere of this particular visit. But then there are two other points at play here. One of them is that there is an election campaign in Israel now. It's election season there. And Netanyahu wanted all along to focus the campaign on foreign policy.
Action over a building plan. Its traditional allies, like Britain, Germany, and Australia, are mad. Some other European countries, like France, have warned of possible punitive steps. Even Israel's staunchest ally, the United States, has spoken up against it. White House spokesman Jay Carney said that the U.S. has communicated its position to Israel.
We reiterate our long-standing opposition to Israeli settlement activity and East Jerusalem construction.
The reason for such a stern reaction is the geography. The E1 is a mostly empty area between the Jewish settlement of Ma'ale Adumim and East Jerusalem. If Israel builds on this area, it would physically cut off Palestinians in the West Bank from their desired future capital, East Jerusalem. And despite the international pressure, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Wednesday that
Hello and welcome to your Access Point to Washington. I'm Ayesha Tanzeem. A day after the UN raised the status of the Palestinian Authority from an entity to a non-member state, Israel retaliated by withholding $100 million in tax revenue from the PA and reviving plans to build 3,000 settler homes in a highly sensitive area of the West Bank called E1. International reaction was severe. VOA's Joy Wagner explains why.
Israel has been building settlements in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem since 1967, and while the international community has declared the settlements illegal, never has Israel seen such a severe reaction.
In security issues rather than the social and economic issues, because the Israeli economy, while doing very well, may be suffering from the effects of world recession as any other big economy in the West. So in that sense, what happened in the UN does not necessarily play badly with the overall strategy of Mr. Netanyahu. Whether we agree with the strategy or not is something else, but from his perspective, that may play into his game plan. And then there is another point, and this is that, look, I mean, all these criticisms were being expressed, some of them more sharp, some of them less sharp. But in the end of the day, when we look at the Middle East today, we know that the real concern of the U.S., of Germany, of France, of Britain, and of Israel is, of course, what's happening in Syria.